Welcome back to Podwavepulse, everyone. Today we're looking into something, well, pretty fascinating, I gotta say. It's about how those initial expectations, about the economic impact of Western sanctions on Russia,
Hmm.
well, they didn't exactly pan out the way many thought they would.
Yeah, it's definitely been interesting, hasn't it? You actually sent over this really insightful document that kind of lays it all out there, showing how Russia has not only kind of managed to stay afloat, but in some areas, actually seen some economic growth, which is, well, pretty surprising to a lot of folks.
Right. And that's exactly what we want to unpack today, like why those initial predictions, especially from, the U.S. and its allies, seem to miss the mark and how Russia has managed to adapt and kind of, show this unexpected resilience. I mean, you specifically wanted to understand this whole complex situation, like quickly and thoroughly with those points in mind. So let's get to it.
It's really important to understand this whole thing, especially considering, the assumptions that often drive international economic policy, right? Like understanding why those initial forecasts weren't totally accurate and how Russia managed to adapt gives us really valuable insight into how complex the global economy really is and even like the effectiveness of sanctions themselves.
For sure. So let's start with some background, especially on those early expectations. So, the sanctions we're talking about, they really ramped up after what happened in Ukraine back in 2022, building on, some earlier measures. And the goal was pretty clear, right? To economically isolate Russia and, basically penalize its geopolitical actions. The U.S. and many other Western countries, they were expecting, a huge drop in Russia's GDP and just massive economic chaos.
And the thinking behind those initial projections, it did make sense, at least on the surface. I mean, cutting off a major economy from Western tech, from financial markets, from trade, it was supposed to, have a massive and rapid effect. And we've seen that happen before, right, with other countries that have been hit hard with sanctions.
Yeah, but the reality, well, it's been pretty different, hasn't it? I mean, Russia did see their GDP shrink in 2022, sure, but it wasn't as bad as a lot of people predicted, and then their economy actually bounced back in 2023. I mean, we saw some real growth there, and projections are even suggesting this trend might just keep going. So, it really makes you think, where did those initial calculations go wrong? What did the U.S. maybe underestimate or completely miss when they were trying to figure out what impact those sanctions would have?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And there are probably a bunch of things that played into it. First off, it seems like they didn't fully grasp how resilient the Russian economy already was, even before this all went down, from those earlier sanctions. They'd already started branching out, finding new trading partners, and boosting their own domestic production in some areas. And then there's the whole global energy market, which really threw a wrench in things. Oil and gas prices went way higher than anyone expected, and that gave Russia this big cushion, bringing in a lot of revenue, even though their export volumes went down some. So maybe those initial forecasts just didn't account for the possibility of those high prices sticking around.
Right, right. So let's dig a bit deeper into how Russia actually managed to, ride this wave. One of the key things seems to be their strategic shift towards Asia. We've seen this enormous jump in trade with countries like China and India, which has really helped them offset some of the losses from reduced trade with their usual Western partners. Remember that document you shared? It highlighted how much India's imports of Russian crude oil skyrocketed after the Ukraine invasion. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing, a 2,000% surge. And here's where it gets even more interesting, especially when we think about, the whole point of those sanctions. A good chunk of that Russian oil, after it's refined in India, gets sent all over the world, even ending up, get this, back in the United States. So what's the big takeaway here for us when we look at this whole reshuffling of global trade? And why might the U.S. have underestimated its potential?
I think the key takeaway, it's not just about the increase in trade volume with Asia, but more about how adaptable and complex global supply chains really are. The U.S. might have been too focused on those direct trade restrictions, not really considering how a big economy like Russia could, go out and find other markets, and maybe even more importantly, how other countries would be willing to keep doing business with them, or even, do even more business. That example with India, it really shows how sanctions can lead to these winding detours in trade flows, which can really water down their impact. And the fact that Russian oil, by way of those Indian refineries ends up back in the U.S., it just highlights how interconnected that global energy market is and how hard it is to truly isolate a major player like Russia.
And it wasn't just about finding new customers, right? The Russian government itself seems to have really stepped in to, like, control the economic fallout with a whole bunch of different policies. We're talking about, like, really strict limits on money flowing out of the country and the central bank making big changes to interest rates to try and, keep the ruble stable. And then on top of that, they ramped up government spending on social programs and financial help for key industries. So looking back, how effective do you think those internal moves were in, softening the blow of the sanctions? And do you think maybe the U.S. underestimated how quickly and how far the Kremlin was willing to go with these measures?
Oh, those government interventions were absolutely crucial in stopping a total economic collapse.
Yeah.
Those capital controls, they probably stopped a massive amount of money from fleeing the country, which would have really tanked the ruble and thrown the whole financial system into chaos. And then the adjustments to interest rates, those were meant to fight inflation and keep some level of, monetary stability. And then you got the increased government spending, which was basically like a giant economic stimulus package, providing a safety net for people and those strategically important businesses. I think it's very possible that the U.S., they might have underestimated how fast and how effectively the Russian government could put these measures into action and just how effective they were in cushioning the immediate shock of the sanctions.
Right. And we can't forget about, Russia's massive reserves of natural resources, especially oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
Even with all those sanctions in place, those high global prices we saw, at least in the beginning, they really gave Russia this significant revenue stream. And that's got to be a big reason why they've been able to keep their economy going and, fund their military operations, despite all the international pressure. But, that document also points out that the ruble losing value and the fact that, oil export volumes have gone down some. Well, those things do point to some weaknesses in the system. So when the U.S. was trying to figure out how impactful those sanctions would be, how do you think they might have misjudged the whole, interplay between Russia's commodity wealth and the limits those sanctions were supposed to put on them?
Yeah, the U.S. probably figured that those sanctions would really cut down on Russia's ability to export their energy, no matter what was happening with global prices. But while there have been some effects, especially with things like shipping logistics getting harder and them having to sell their oil at a discount, Russia still managed to find buyers, especially over in Asia. And those higher global prices, driven by a lot of things, including, the geopolitical situation itself, well, they gave Russia this unexpected cash influx that helped offset some of those lower export volumes. Plus, the U.S. might have overestimated how quickly Europe could completely ditch Russian energy, which means Russia's had this, ongoing, even if smaller, revenue stream for longer than maybe they expected.
Now, another really interesting part of how Russia has adapted is this whole import substitution thing, which is basically them trying to, boost their own domestic production to fill the gaps left by all those Western companies pulling out. And then there's this, kind of intriguing concept of parallel imports, which sounds like a way to sidestep those restrictions and still get their hands on important foreign goods. And that whole thing about the dark fleet, those older ships with hidden ownership that they're using to move oil around secretly. That's a pretty striking example of these adaptive strategies. So how important have these efforts been in helping Russia get through these really tough sanctions? And do you think maybe those initial assessments didn't fully account for these kinds of workarounds?
It's been pretty remarkable, honestly, how effective those strategies have been in, lessening the blow of the sanctions. They've had some success with that import substitution, especially in areas that aren't as technologically advanced, although they still rely on foreign parts for a lot of industries, which is a problem. But those parallel imports, they've been a lifeline. Even if it costs them more and is less reliable, it's how they're getting a whole range of goods. And then you've got that dark fleet, which really shows how creative and how far a country will go when they're determined to get around restrictions on their main exports. It wouldn't surprise me if those early U.S. assessments didn't fully grasp how big and how successful those alternative supply chains and domestic production efforts could be.
So it seems like it's been a bunch of things together, right? The changes they'd already made to their economy, the global energy market, those proactive policies from their government, successfully shifting their trade relationships, and these unconventional ways of getting imports. All of that has helped Russia's economy be more resilient than anyone expected. It wasn't just one single thing, but more like this, multi-pronged response.
Exactly. It really shows just how complicated it is to impose these kinds of broad economic sanctions on a big resource-rich country that already has established trade partners and a government that's, really determined. And you can't forget about how interconnected the global economy is, which just creates more opportunities to, work around things and adapt.
So basically what we're seeing here is that the U.S. and its allies might have initially miscalculated the impact of those sanctions on Russia because they underestimated a few key things. They didn't fully appreciate how resilient Russia's economy already was, how likely it was that those high global commodity prices would stick around, how quickly and effectively the Russian government would respond with their own policies, and just how adaptable Russia could be in shifting its trade relationships and finding, unusual ways to keep getting the goods and access the markets it needed. All of that together is why Russia has been able to withstand what were supposed to be, the toughest sanctions around.
And what's really interesting here? It's how a country facing this much international economic pressure has managed to not just survive, but in some areas, actually grow. It really makes us rethink those assumptions we have about how effective economic sanctions really are as a geopolitical tool, especially in a world where power is spread out among different players.
Thank you all for listening to Podwavepulse. If you found today's discussion insightful, please subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses.